Chapter 14. Down the corridor, sharp left turn along the passageway. Paul caught up with her just outside the small interview room. She turned and smiled at him. It was a dazzling smile, white teeth and full red lips and cornflower blue eyes. He'd never seen her before in his life. "Oh," he said. "You, darling?" "It's you, isn't it?" he said in a weary voice, pretending. "I don't know what you mean," she said, but she spoilt it rather by grinning. Paul shut his eyes, leaned back against the nearest wall, and groaned. "What's up, lover?" asked Mr. Tanner's mum. "You look like you've just ate a slug kebab." "Vicky," Paul said. "That girl on reception. She just told me we're married." Mr. Tanner's mum frowned. "What, you and her? That's... No. Paul banged on the wall with his fist. "Me and you. Us. Is that right?" Mr. Tanner's mum rolled out another smile, even dreamier than the last one. "I can hardly believe it myself," she said. "Sometimes I have to stop and... Oh, for God's sake!" Paul felt his knees fold, as though the cartilage had turned into wet cardboard. He slid down the wall and squatted on the carpet. "It's you," he repeated. "Mr. Tanner's mum, you're a bloody goblin." Silence, just long enough to blow your nose in. "Oh," she said. "You found out. Somebody told you." "No." "Well, you can't have figured it all out by yourself. And don't suppose it came to you in a dream. It was that bitch Vicky, wasn't it? I'm going to wring her skinny neck." "It wasn't her," Paul muttered. "Nothing like that. Long story, really. Can't be bothered telling you now." He opened his eyes, sat up a bit. "How long?" he asked. "How long have we been married?" "Yes." 3 months, she replied. 3 glorious, wonderful... Fucking snot, Paul yelped. "You're kidding." "No, I'm not," Mr. Tanner's mum said irritably. "Whirlwind romance. You swept me off my feet, you tiger, you. Then 3 weeks honeymoon in Marrawatta Ponds." Paul lifted his head. "Where?" "Marrawatta Ponds, in Australia, New South Wales. You must remember our honeymoon." "No, and please," he added quickly, "don't tell me why it was unforgettable, because I really don't." He frowned. "Australia," he said. "Let me guess. Right in the heart of bauxite country, yes?" "Well, yes, actually. At least I did hear somewhere they'd found a large, previously undiscoverable bauxite deposits quite near where we were, but... And we used to go for long romantic walks in the evening. Out in the desert." "Oh, forget it," he added quickly, before she could answer. It doesn't matter, really. This is awful. It's... He paused, rewinding back through what Sophie had said to him on the phone back in the flat. "I don't think you should be screwing around my head like this," she'd said, "at this stage in our relationship." As soon as he'd heard the R word, Paul had jumped to the obvious conclusion, like a tree frog trying to win an Olympic gold, because it was the conclusion he wanted to jump to, presumably, or something like that. But someone like Sophie, the R word, he remembered, did tend to figure quite heavily in her vocabulary. Bloody useless, sloppy language. English. You could have a relationship with someone that didn't involve love, kisses, choosing cushion covers and arguments about washing up rotors. You could have a working relationship with a colleague, for example, or... "Excuse me," he said. "Can I ask you something?" Mr. Tanner's mum blinked. "Sure." "I mean," he went on, "you're a pretty observant sort of person, and I don't suppose much gets past you, right?" "I suppose so, yes." "Fine. Am I having an affair with Sophie Pettingale?" There had been times in the recent past, but in other dimensions, so maybe it didn't count, when he had betted good money that nothing in the known universe could ever leave Mr. Tanner's mum at a loss for words. Typical, of course. You finally see the thing that you thought you'd never see, but by then you don't give a toss anymore. "What did you just say?" I asked you a question," Paul replied briskly. "Come on, it's not exactly rocket science. Am I having it away with Sophie Pettingale or not?" "Well, She opened and closed her perfect rosebud mouth a few times and then shrugged. "I don't know," she said. "I'd have thought you'd have known, but maybe it slipped your mind or something. You better ask her, and if the answer's yes, I'll see to it personally that what's left of both of you gets buried in separate graves a long way apart. Paul, are you feeling all right? Something tells me you aren't quite yourself today." Couldn't help laughing at that. "To put it mildly," he replied, "who I quite am right now is a bloody good question, but I haven't got time. Listen, no, just this once, shut up and listen, will you? Thanks. Have you still got the portable door?" She flinched just a bit, so when she said, "What's a portable door?" He knew she was lying. "The portable door," he repeated. "Plastic thing like a picnic mat with a door drawn on it. You slap it on the wall and then you can go places. Have you still got it or not?" Maybe she really did love him, because when he looked at her, all stern and fierce, she sort of wilted and nodded her head. "Who told you about that?" she said. "That cow on reception?" For a moment the word cow threw Paul quite badly. "No," he said. "Nobody told me. Well, you did. But that's another long story. In fact, it's a bloody epic. I need it." "What?" "The portable bloody door, of course." He calmed himself down. It took some doing. "I need to use the portable door for something," he said. "It's very important. I promise you I'll give—" He checked himself. For some reason he felt it was important to be precise in his use of words. "You'll get it back," he said, because after all, that had already happened. "I promise. But I really do need it right now." Mr. Tanner's mum looked at him, and he could see that she was desperately worried about something. Another time, in another place, he'd have had real problems with that look. "Paul," she said, "what do you want it for?" "Trust me." "About as far as I could fight you. What do you want it for? Is it because you've just found out I'm really a goblin?" It was nice to be able to tell the truth sometimes. "No," Paul said. "Absolutely not. Got nothing at all to do with that, I swear." "Oh," she frowned. "Is it a work thing then?" "You could say that." "Yes," he said. "Just work, really. But I do need it, desperately. Go on," he added, though he knew it wasn't fair. "Please." Even then she hesitated a full half-second. "Oh, go on then," she said. "But I do want it back." "Guaranteed," Paul said. "It's as good as done." It was, of course, in the strong room, in a tatty-looking black tin box on the top shelf. Paul's hands shook slightly as he smoothed it out on the wall, and it wasn't just the cord. "Thanks," he said. "I'll make it up to you soon." Mr. Tanner's mum looked at him, and there was that worried expression again, and for just a split second he thought, "Actually, she's very pretty, and nice too, apparently, and I think she likes me. And so what if she's a goblin? I'm a bloody goblin too, partly, but it wouldn't be right, or fair. Somewhere else, somewhere where he belonged, there was a mess that had to be put right, and if he didn't do it, nobody would, and then everything would be wrong forever, and this time it really would be his fault." Also, he couldn't help but reflect. He didn't really want to find out how Mr. Tanner felt about having Paul as a father-in-law. "Thanks," he repeated. You're really quite nice, actually, some of the time." "Paul?" she said, but by then he was halfway through the door and thinking back. Paul stepped out through the doorway, and a large clawed hand clamped itself around his shoulder. "Got you," said a voice, and quite a few of the liberal, open-minded, non-judgmental things he'd been thinking about goblin kind in general a few moments ago got deleted with extreme prejudice. "Ouch!" Paul said. "That hurts." "Good," replied the goblin. "How about that?" "That too," Paul replied truthfully. "Look, would it help if I promised to come quietly?" "No." "Fine." "Ouch, ouch, 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 ouch," he thought in advance, and then he shut his eyes and deliberately fell backwards. Just as he was about to land heavily across the threshold of the portable door, he tore his thoughts away from the excruciating pain of talons clenched into his shoulder and concentrated hard on a date, a time, and a place. The goblin hit the deck first, of course, but he hoped very much that it was too preoccupied with Paul resisting arrest to fill his mind with anything that might contradict what Paul was thinking. Screamed a goblin voice underneath him as he landed. "Back! Look where you're going, can't you?" Sorry," Paul said as he scrambled to his feet. "Did I hurt you?" "Yes," snarled the goblin. But Paul was standing up, hastily shutting the door and rolling it up. Only then did he turn round. Perfect. He was standing in his office. There was the calendar on his desk, and the date was wonderfully, beautifully right. He helped the goblin up. "What the hell am I doing here?" the goblin asked. "We aren't supposed to come out until 5:30. Paul shrugged. Sorry," he said. "Can't help you there. I'd get back to the cellars quick if I were you." "Too bloody right," the goblin muttered and bolted, leaving Paul finally, blissfully alone. Joy, he thought. Absolute bloody joy. He'd taken himself back to his office on the day of Mr. Tanner's mum's baby's christening party. He hadn't yet killed Ricky Wormtorter, or metamorphosed into Philip Marlowe. He hadn't been killed yet, not even once. Furthermore, he resolved grimly, he wasn't going to be, not if he could help it, which he could. Just to make absolutely sure, he took out his wallet and looked at his bank card. He read the words printed on it and grinned. "Sorry, Canada," he said aloud. "Nothing personal." Paul glanced at his watch, but it had stopped, and he couldn't find it in his heart to blame it. Anyway, there was a perfectly good clock on his office wall, and it told him the time was 10:35. Perfect. Down the corridor, up one flight of stairs, and down another, along more stupid passageways, fuck this horrible bloody building for being so big, he stopped just around the corner from Benny Shumway's office, caught his breath, and waited. A second or so passed. Then Benny came out with a file under his arm and disappeared around a corner. Great. Paul sneaked up to the office door and slipped in. There, leaning against the wall, was the sword. If he remembered right, its name was Skofnung, and it was a magical, trans-dimensional, self-motivated pain in the bum. It was also, unfortunately, essential to his plan. A plan! Whoopee! Here I am, alone against the universe, but I have a plan. So that's all right, then. He picked it up and very carefully drew it out of its scabbard. It looked horribly sharp, and the way the light glinted on the blade was depressingly sinister, like the grin on a face of a goblin. Loathsome bloody thing, he thought. Then he turned to face the door in the wall, the one Benny used when he did the daily run to the bank. Any moment now. Someone was bashing on it, from the other side. Of course, Paul had seen that, and heard it before. Last time round, it had scared him out of his wits, because he'd naturally assumed that whoever, or whatever was out there, wasn't going to be his friend. Actually, he hadn't been far wide of the mark at that, because, according to all his relatives and friends, the bloke on the other side of the door had been his worst enemy for the past 23 years. Instead of slamming back the bolts, he drew them. Then, as soon as there was a lull in the hammering and bashing, he turned the knob and pulled the door open. "Come on," he said, "and stop making that bloody racket." A head and body flopped through the door like an exhausted salmon eventually making it to the top of a waterfall. "Thanks," said the newcomer. I'd almost given up." The newcomer stopped short. He was staring. "Yes, all right," Paul said impatiently. "It's me, us. Long story, another time. Now, here's what we've got to do." "Fuck!" the newcomer yelped. And of course the newcomer was Paul himself. To be precise, the Paul who died at Mr. Tanner's mum's christening party, slaughtered a virtual TV anchorman, and sprinted across the empty plains of the land of the dead after Benny Shumway, only to arrive just as the door was bolted. He could remember the despair he'd felt as he'd pounded on the door with his fists until they ached, and nobody had heard him. Nobody had rushed to help him. In fact, as he knew better than anybody, some bastard on the other side had shot all the bolts and wedged the door shut with a filing cabinet. His own worst enemy indeed. But the other Paul, the one he'd just let through the door, wouldn't have that memory. The way he would remember it would be bashing on the door and yelling, and the door opening and seeing himself standing there on the other side, looking all stressy and tense. Also, this sucker had only died, 3 times? Once by his own hand, once by a bolt from Ricky's crossbow, once stabbed to death by goblins. A mere novice when it came to dying, a mortality virgin. "You might at least pretend you're pleased to see me," he said. "I've been to a lot of trouble on your behalf. The least you could do is simulate a little gratitude." Sorry," said the other Paul instinctively. "And shut that bloody door, will you?" Oh, yes, right." Paul leaned past his other self and made sure all the bolts were shot home and all the latches were dropped. "Come on," he said. "Time we weren't here. Benny could be back any moment, and it'd be really, really embarrassing if he sees the two of us." Where to go? That was the question. Awkward. He hesitated for a moment. "You've got the sword," said his alter ego. "What?" "That sword I got at the christening party. I thought I'd lost it back in there." "You did," Paul said. "You're careless as well as feckless, but fortunately I'm here to tidy up after you. Closed file store," he added. "Only logical place. Come on." Luckily they made it to the closed file store without meeting anybody. Paul closed the door and then wedged it shut with the sword. "Sit down," he said. And don't interrupt, because it's going to be a bit complicated, and I know you've got the attention span of a goldfish. Ready?" Yes, I suppose so." So Paul started to explain, and his identical twin listened. Interesting study the other Paul's face made. First, of course, utter bewilderment, then the gradual dawn of understanding, then a very intense, almost fierce concentration, then the effects of a rather nasty set of implications, starting as a tiny glimmer of doubt and spreading into a pall of gloomy acceptance. Watching himself listening to him, Paul was actually rather impressed. A bit more stoicism, courage even, than he'd have expected from himself under such circumstances. He never knew he had it in him. "Any questions?" he concluded. The other Paul shrugged. "Not really," he said, and then a pause. Then, not really very hopefully, "I don't suppose there's another way, is there? I mean, another approach we haven't considered yet, or one that doesn't involve me getting... Nope, Paul replied. Sorry, but look at it this way. 1, by rights, you shouldn't be here at all. The goblins killed you fair and square. 2, all right, it's not looking good as far as you're concerned. But look on the bright side, with any luck I'm going to make it. And you're me and I'm you, so really it's all as broad as it is long. Right? I guess. The other him didn't sound totally convinced, but he was trying his best, bless him. And I suppose if one of us has got to... Quite, Paul replied. And the simple fact of the matter is, I'm the real me and you're just some sort of anomaly. So... No way! I'm the real me and you're the bloody byproduct. Sorry. The other Paul shook his head. It doesn't actually matter, does it? He said. It's got to be me, you're right. Only, isn't it just fucking typical? It's always me that loses out, even against my bloody self. Paul tried to think of something to say. Something comforting, something ennobling, something that would help his tormented alter ego find some degree of inner peace in the face of the horror that lay ahead of him. Oh well, he said. Never mind. You ready? As I'll ever be. You'll need this, of course. The other Paul took the sword unwillingly, as if it was something slimy and horrid. Thanks, he said. Our biggest mistake, Paul told him. Well, one of our biggest mistakes, anyhow. Not figuring it out sooner. I wouldn't know, the other Paul replied peevishly. I wasn't there at the time. Fine, Paul frowned. My mistake, then. Only I should have known when Vicky told me she and Ricky had been married. Bloody great big hint. Went right over my head like a flock of migrating geese. Still, got there in the end. We got there, replied his other self, and Paul couldn't be bothered to point out the inconsistency. Well, the other Paul went on, I'd like to say it was a pleasure meeting you, but lying to yourself is a mug's game, right? Paul stood up. Look, if it's any consolation, this is all for the best, and I think what you're doing is actually pretty cool, so, yes, well, you would, wouldn't you? No pleasing some people. You coming? Paul snapped. Or what? What do you think? Of course I'm coming. Other Paul trailed wearily to the door and then paused. One bright side to all this, he said. I can't wait to see the look on bloody Wormtoter's face. Paul grinned. Me too, he said, and then he stopped and pulled a face. Idiot, he said. Not you, he added. Me. Pretty much academic, surely? Oh, be quiet. Sophie, he added. We need Sophie or it's not going to work. Only there's 2 of us, the other self said, which is going to freak her out no end. Still, can't be helped, omelettes and eggs. Paul sighed. I guess so. I suppose I'll just have to explain it all to her later on. Other Paul grinned. Rather you than me, chum. All right, I'll stay here. You go and fetch her, okay? He found Sophie eventually in the photocopier room. She was running off something like 1,000 copies of a big fat document, sorting, collating, stapling. He came in quietly and she didn't hear him over the whir and clatter of the machine, which had once, of course, been the younger Mr. Wells, but there wasn't enough space left in his mind for side issues that size. He looked at the back of her head and thought, only you and no other. And then he asked himself, why, for pity's sake? What's so special about her as against, say, Vicky or Demelza Horrocks, or even, within certain firmly defined parameters, Mr. Tanner's mum? Paul thought about that for 2, maybe 2.5 seconds, and realised that he didn't know, that there wasn't an answer, just as there's never any answer to those simple but incredibly difficult questions you ask when you're 4 years old, and a grown-up just looks at you all cross and embarrassed and says, just because, that's why. And of course that's the only real true answer to that kind of question. There are long-winded ways of saying the same thing, involving lengthy digressions and background materials and abstruse and nebulous concepts, but they're just another way of saying that same old thing. Why? Because, and that's how you know it's true love. If you love someone for or because of something, it doesn't count. It's admiration, appreciation, or the recognition of some resource she's got that you can exploit to your own advantage. Unless it's just because. It can't be unconditional, instinctive, involuntary. Doesn't count. No good. Sophie, he said. What? She turned around, banged her elbow against the machine's dust cover, dropped a sheaf of pages, swore, scowled at him. Oh, it's you. What? Oh, nothing, he said. I just wondered if you were, busy right now, that's all. She gave him that over-crying-out-loud look that he knew so well. Do I look busy? Yes, fairly. Fine. No need to ask then, was there? Sorry, only, I need your help with something, and, it won't take a moment. No, look, I've got to do this stupid copying for Mr. Suslowich, then there's a bloody great pile of filing for Mr. Bloody Tanner, and then...
Really, he said, it won't take 10 seconds, and you're so busy already, one more little thing's not going to make any odds, is it?
Paul?
Yes?
No.
Oh, he took a step back as though a real door had been slammed in his face. Please? She sighed.
Can't you get someone else to help you?
Not really.
Why? What is it you want me to do?
It's, there's never a word around when you need one, is there? It's, complicated. Take longer to explain it than actually do it. If you follow me, look, it would be really kind of you if you could just spare me 2 seconds.
Paul, it was a sort of combination half scowl, half grin. Did anybody ever tell you you're really annoying when you're being pathetic?
He nodded. And really pathetic when I'm being annoying. Yes, actually, he added. I think it was you.
Sounds like the sort of thing I'd say. She frowned. All right, but you've got to promise you'll do the Mortensons for me tomorrow morning. All right?
Sure. No problem in promising that. All right, so that's settled, is it?
What do you want, a signed contract? They didn't say anything to each other on the way to the closed file store.
When they got there, he lunged past her, pulled open the door and darted in, saying, "This way," or something equally pointless. As he devoutly hoped, there he was, the other him, waiting.
Paul, look, what's...
She stopped just inside the door, for once completely speechless. The two Pauls smiled feebly at her, and Paul said, "Hi, it's us." A moment of deep silence, and then,
Paul, what the fuck?
Long story, very long story. Think Robert Jordan and multiply it by 3. Meanwhile, it's very important that you see this. Here, look. The other Paul drew the sword out of its scabbard, knelt down and laid it carefully on the ground. She looked at it and said,
Paul, what the hell's that got to do with...
and stopped.
Oh, she said.
Other Paul stood up and got out of the way quickly as Sophie crouched down and looked at the sword. Her hair, falling forward from behind her ear, brushed the gleaming brown with silver swirls blade. She looked up.
I don't understand, she said. It's like, I know this. Like,
she pulled a face, angry and frightened and confused.
Like it's, I don't know, family or something. Paul, what the hell's going on?
He knelt down beside her. I don't really know, he said. Not all of it, but apparently this is some kind of magic sword. And the way it works is, it's in 2 parts. There's the actual sharp metal thing, and then there's a human that sort of goes with it, its other half. And he stopped, taking on board a small but vital moment of understanding that had eluded him till now. The thing is, he went on, neither of them works without the other. No, that's not it. Neither of them is right without the other. What I mean is, you can't use a sword unless you've got the girl too, and... He looked away for a moment. And vice versa, he added. And I've actually had this stupid thing for months now. It was under the sofa. Ricky gave it to me, but I hadn't actually figured out the rest of it. You see, all this time I'd got the idea that the other half of this sword was, well, someone else. But now I finally got it straight in my mind, that part of it, anyway, it was you all along, and I was too stupid to realise. Pause.
Me?
Paul dipped his head slowly. That's right, you're this thing's other half, so...
Vice versa?
He nodded again. I think it sort of explains a lot of stuff about, us. Only it wasn't us, it was stupid bloody magic getting in the way and screwing us around as usual, and...
So who's he then?
The other Paul might have muttered, "the cat's mother," under his breath, or not. He wasn't helping matters, and Paul ignored him. That's a different story, well, part of the same story, but... way off at right angles. The thing is, unless I fight a duel to the death with Ricky Wormtoter, not here, somewhere else, which reminds me we need a goblin called Colin, unless we have this stupid duel, the whole of history for the last 1,000 of years is going to get really screwed up, and it's all Van Spee's fault, but I'm the only one who can sort it out. Actually, it's a real bugger. That's why I need you to help me. Sophie scowled at him.
You said it'd only take 2 seconds.
I exaggerated, but I will still do the Mortensons for you.
After you saved the world, you mean?
Paul nodded. Sure, he said, assuming there's a world left tomorrow. No problem. She thought for a moment or so.
I'd still like to know exactly what you meant by vice versa.
Look,
and anyway, she went on, you and me breaking up, it wasn't about magic. Well, not all anyway. Partly it's because you're shallow and emotionally retarded and completely self-centred and inconsiderate, and... She stopped,
Yes, go on. Actually, a deep, thoughtful frown on Sophie's face. Yes, you're all that stuff, but that wasn't it. I mean, that's the kind of thing you have endless rows and tears and yelling over. But it's not why we split up. I don't know why we split up. Do you? Paul smiled. Because? What? Because of Countess Judy, he said. It really was just because of her, doing horrible things to your mind. And also this sword stuff too. That was something to do with it. But whatever it was just all magic crap. All JWW and work and nothing to do with us. That's why...
Sophie raised her hand. Miss Hook used to do something just like that, Paul remembered, when she wanted to shut the class up. Forget it, she said. We'll talk about it later. A lot. For now, though, what are you actually going to do with that, thing?
Like I said, Paul replied, I've got to fight Ricky Wormtoter.
But you can't do that. He'll murder you. You don't know split about sword fighting and stuff.
Paul shook his head. Not important, he said. The sword sees to all of that sort of thing. I've just got to, be there. And you two, of course. And shit, he added. There's something I've forgotten.
Sophie rolled her eyes. Paul, she said.
No, it's all right, really. He turned to his other self. Vicky, he said. What about her? We'll need her too, or it won't work. Look, can you go and find her and bring her here? What did your last slave die of? The other Paul grumbled and left the room. That made a difference. The presence of a third party, even though it had been the second party in duplicate, had made things a bit tense, but also easier in a way, because they couldn't really discuss, the personal stuff in front of someone else. Now they could talk, and they had nothing to do for 5 minutes or so. No reason not to. Bloody hell, Paul thought, and cleared his throat. Sophie, he said. Well, Christ. I don't know how to put this, Paul said with transparent sincerity, but I think we ought to give it another go. If you'd like to, I mean. She looked at him. Not really, she said. Oh. Bugger, he thought. It was one of those horrible relationship moments where it was your fault for not being a telepath and knowing exactly what she was thinking, so you could say the right thing. He could see Sophie waiting with imperfectly disguised impatience. She wasn't actually tapping her foot or looking pointedly at her watch, but absolutely the next best thing. And he couldn't think of anything to say to not really, which was odd, because twice now, or was it 3 times, it lost count, it faced down death and made it go away just by refusing to accept the unacceptable. The difference was, of course, that he couldn't give a shit about death's feelings. Not really, she repeated, because if we did, we'd be right back where we started, and it wouldn't be right for either of us, because I can't ever be me so long as you're afraid to be you, and it'd all just get fraught and horrible again, and I wouldn't be able to breathe, and anyway, you're just about to trot off and get yourself killed by Ricky bloody Wormtoter, so why the hell would be the bloody point? Whereupon, and this was rather worse than facing Mr. Dow against a backdrop of nothing whatsoever, Sophie started to sniffle, and a tear leaked out of the corner of her eye, like oil from a knackered gasket, and of course that was all his fault too. No, I'm not, he said. Yes, you are. Great, Paul thought. Panto time. No, I'm not, he said briskly. That's what he's for. Sophie cut off the snuffles abruptly in mid-sniff. What? Him, Paul said. The other me. I'm not going to fight Ricky. He is. But that's... Yes, Paul said savagely. I know, but someone's got to do it, and I'm sick to the teeth of dying. I figure it's some other bugger's turn. Besides, he's dead already, so it's not like it'll put him out or anything. Paul? Her I'm warning you voice. He ignored it. I was in Benny Shumway's office, he said. It was a strange morning. I'd died, you see. None of this had happened yet, by the way, he added helpfully. And it's not going to either, if I've anything to do with it. But I'm drifting off topic. Where was I? Sorry, yes. What should happen, you see, is this. Tonight I go along to Mr. Tanner's mum's christening party. Is that tonight? Hell, I'd forgotten all about it. Tonight, Paul repeated. And I've said I'll be the godfather, right? What I don't know is the role of godfather in a goblin christening is, sacrificial. They killed me, bloody goblins, jumped out of a cake and stabbed me to death. Sophie was staring at him. Probably she was just shell-shocked by his reckless disregard for tenses, but at least he had her attention. Anyway, Paul went on, I died, and you remember me telling you about Mr. Dow from the bank? Well, he was there, and I won't bore you with the details, but I sort of escaped and ran like hell, and I reached the connecting door in Benny's office just as he was shutting it behind him. I stood there banging on it and yelling, but of course nobody answered, and then I figured out another way of escaping, so that was all right. But a couple of days later, when I'd come back to life... sorry, am I going too fast for you or something?
Oh, no, Sophie said in a quiet, stunned voice. Go on.
Like I said, Paul continued, it was like being a really weird morning, but what the hell. Anyway, I had to go into Benny Shumway's office to get something. Benny wasn't in, and then I heard this terrible banging and shrieking coming through the connecting door. Well, naturally I got out of there, fast as I could, but afterwards I got to thinking and I realised it wasn't some hideous undead fiend trying to get through from the other side that was making all that racket. It had to have been me. She was looking at him again.
Okay, she said. Let's say, for argument's sake.
And then the next time, Paul went on, the next time I died, and there was Mr. Dow waiting for me, he tried to take me away, but I didn't want to go, and guess what? It turned out that he couldn't. He couldn't because he didn't have any jurisdiction over me. That's what he said, but that didn't make any sense because I'm not immortal or anything, unless, of course, what he meant was I can't die because I'm dead already. He couldn't take me away again because he'd already got me, and that, Paul concluded, was what made me think of whatever it was on the other side of the door in Benny's room. It had to be another me, the one who's already dead, and of course, all the fuck-ups can't be sorted out until Ricky and I have our duel, and obviously I'm not going to survive it, but it doesn't matter a toss because I won't be the one he slashes to bits. It'll be the other me, the dead one. He paused. You see what I'm getting at, don't you?
No.
But it didn't matter because the door opened and the other Paul came back, and Vicky was with him. She took a couple of steps into the room, saw Sophie and the sword, which was lying on the floor, and screamed. Then very quickly indeed, Vicky punched the other Paul in the mouth and tried to get to the door. Much to the real Paul's surprise, the other Paul was too quick for her. He grabbed her by the wrist and yanked her back as though she was an overexcited dog on a lead. For a moment, Vicky looked as though she was going to make a serious fight of it, but then she just drooped and flopped back against the wall.
That's not fair, she said. You're pathetic, all three of you.
Paul stepped forward, trying to be reassuring. It's all right, he told her. It's not like that, really. What we're going to do is we're going to find Ricky now.
Just a minute,
Sophie interrupted, and there was something in her voice that suggested breaking strain.
What did she mean, all three?
You, Paul said, and the sword and me. That's right, isn't it? Vicky gave him a nasty look and nodded.
You're all right, she said to Sophie. You've got your other half, so if we fight now, you'll win and it'll all be over. But it'd be cheating and...
Oh, for pity's sake, Paul protested. Why doesn't anybody ever listen? Sophie and Vicky turned and both of them scowled at him instead of at each other. Sophie, he said, it's like this. In this duel I've got to have with Ricky, both of us, him and me, we've got to have these stupid magic swords, right? I've got one of them and you've got the other half of it. Ricky's got the other and
the other half of Turving is me, Vicky interrupted, and Ricky thought he could break the spell by marrying me. Now let's not beat about the bush. First, he got that bitch Countess Judy to wipe out my memory so I wouldn't know who and what I am. Then he married me. Thank God Frank Leartides found out about it and made Countess Judy put it right.
Anyway, Paul said firmly, Vicky thinks we've tricked her here without her other half, the other magic sword, so we can cheat by killing her. That's what she thinks, he added, because she may be a supernatural being of exceptional power and able to transcend the elements at will, but she's got the common sense of a small beetle.
Hey,
Vicky protested, but it didn't do her any good, and Sophie, in spite of herself, giggled. What we're actually going to do, Paul went on, is cross over into Custard space, which is where Ricky's hiding right now.
Into where?
Sophie demanded. And we're going to have the duel, and that will be that. He turned to Vicky. All right, he said. What will that do, as far as you're concerned? Vicky looked a bit doubtful, but nodded.
Fine by me, she said. Of course, if you could spare an extra 10 minutes or so. First we could grab hold of him and hold him down and smash his face in with a baseball bat, and then have the duel. But I can see why you're not keen on that idea. Pity.
Yes, Paul said, it is, but I don't want to risk screwing things up. I mean, what if we broke his arm or sprained his thumb or something, and he couldn't fight in the duel? Then everything would be all cock again, and all the checkbooks would have English on one side and French on the other. No, you'll just have to be magnanimous and forgive him, right?
I'll forgive him, Vicky said pleasantly, provided you promise faithfully to chop his arms and legs off in the duel and make him eat them with salsa dip. Well, she added, his legs and his left arm, he'll be needing the other one to kill you with.
Or, Paul replied after a brief, fraught pause. You can carry on hating him to bits. I don't care. I mean, I'd like it if everybody was friends and we all laid aside our differences and tried to get along, but it's no big deal. And I suppose if we're going to be fighting to the death... Vicky grinned. How charmingly naive, she said. Your trouble is you don't think things through. I mean, I'm assuring you figured out that Ricky is actually King Hring, which means he's over 1,300 years old, yes? Paul nodded glumly. Been trying not to think about that, he admitted. Too weird for me, but yes, I suppose if you're going to take it to its logical conclusion, that's who he's got to be. I suppose he's been hanging around ever since, trying to keep out of everybody's way. Vicky shook her head. Not everybody's, she replied. Just... that's... She nodded curtly towards the sword lying on the floor. The thing about a living sword is, she said, once it's drawn in anger, it's got to finish the fight, otherwise it can't rest easy. Now everything was fine until Theo bloody Van Spee interfered. We'd had the duel, Ricky and I lost, but that's the rub of the green, and at least the fight was over. But then Theo stuck his oar in. The duel was interrupted. He whisked Ricky away from the island by magic, brought him here, even got him a job as a junior clerk. And Ricky worked hard, eventually got made a partner. All completely wrong, of course. It left both of us, my sword and hers, stranded, marooned in mid-obligation. We had to finish the fight, but Ricky didn't want to, for obvious reasons. He was the one who was supposed to lose, and his opponent... Suddenly she grinned without the slightest trace of levity. What do you suppose came of his opponent? Paul sighed. That'd be me, right? That'll be you, yes. What? Sophie yelled. You mean to say he's 1,300 years old too? In a sense. Paul had a nasty feeling that Vicky was enjoying this. What actually happened was, as soon as the duel was interrupted, there was a breach in normality, for want of a better word. Stuff had gone wrong, and that called into existence an Avenger. It's automatic, it just happens that way. It's like Screw-Up comes to life and turns into a person. Paul took a deep breath. Mr. Laertides. Excellent! Vicky clapped her hands together like a little girl. Frank Laertides! Of course, the timescale is completely screwy. The duel happened 13 centuries ago, but Van Spee chose to fuck everything up 30 years ago. So he went back 1,370 years from his own time, did the screwing up, substituted Tyrving, that's me, for that stupid clunky old axe Rosie Tanner, and came back home. Meanwhile, 1,300 years ago, the screw-up makes Frank Laertides suddenly come to life. But he can't just fast forward through 13 centuries to catch up with Theo and kick his arse. No, Frank had to go the long way round. More than that, in order to fix Theo's fuck-up, he had to restage the duel, and of course that would be difficult if Ricky's opponent, King Hraw, had conked out from extreme old age back in the early 9th century AD. Which means, not only did Frank have to wait around kicking his heels for 1,300 years, he had to bring King Hraw with him. She smiled almost affectionately. Just as well, really, that Frank's a very resourceful guy, or he wouldn't be alive now, for one thing. Long silence. You mean, Paul said slowly, he brought me with him? That's right. Vicky nodded gravely. Now you're getting it. And yes, that does mean that technically you're 1,300 and something odd years old. There's a word for it. Well preserved, Paul suggested. Undead, Vicky corrected him, which accounts for a lot of things that must have seemed a bit odd to you, come to think of it, like how you've been able to pop in and out of the land of the dead like a commuter catching the bus, why you found the portable door when you first arrived here, why Ricky shot you with a crossbow a few months back. No, that was an accident, Paul protested. Well, a misunderstanding. Balls, Vicky replied. Deliberate. He wanted to kill you so you'd never be able to fight the duel, and he could make it look like it was misunderstanding, all part of the Countess Judy fiasco. But you didn't die because you're undead. Was Ricky pissed off or what? It also explains, Vicky went on, how come your mother and, she frowned, how your mother and father were able to sell you to the firm to pay for their retirement. I'm surprised you didn't wonder about that, because strictly speaking, selling people isn't all that legal these days. Paul shrugged. I assumed it was, well, magic and stuff, so the rules didn't apply. Vicky shook her head. Not at all. The rules didn't apply because they only cover living human beings, a category, she added sweetly, into which you do not fall.
Now then, she went on, I hope that makes everything lambently clear. Paul tried not to snigger, but with indifferent success.
Absolutely, he said. The good thing is, he went on, I'm getting to where I can just ignore a lot of this stuff, at least in the short term, so I'm undead, and presumably Wormtoter is too.
Yes,
and let's get this absolutely straight. If we go back to Ireland and fight a duel to the death, your stupid magic sword against mine, things will go back to how they're supposed to be, and it'll all be all right again.
Yes. Well, Vicky said with a slight frown, not entirely. Strictly speaking, if two of the undead fight, it's a duel to the undeath. But in real terms,
fine.
It was as though someone had just switched Paul on at the mains. He jumped up and the other hand moved simultaneously like a semi-detached shadow.
Let's do it then. No time like the present, right?
Well, again, it's not actually the... Paul pulled a horrible fierce and Vicky stopped herself. All right, she said. I get the message. The finer points are completely wasted on you, aren't they?
Yes. Paul waited for a moment and then said, all right, how do we get there? I mean, I'm assuming that it's something to do with living swords transcending the dimensions, and no, I really don't want a lecture on the theoretical basis of how it works. Do I have to press a button or pull a lever or what?
No need. Vicky smiled at him, and behind her, a flock of startled ducks clattered noisily off the misty surface of the water and flew away, their resentful quacking echoing back from the rocky cliffs of the distant fjord. We're here,